Despite the government's high hopes, it seems that the Paycheck Protection Program did not have the intended impact that it originally thought it did. Here is a Harvard professor of public economics, Rod Chetty, talking about the data.
And so I'm going to start here with a set of smaller firms that have about 100 to 500 employees on average that would have been eligible for these loans if they chose to take them up. And this is showing you employment trends for those firms. You can see a pretty steady decline. April 3rd here marks where the checks went out. Now I want to compare that to firms that we think are likely to be above the threshold for eligibility, firms with about 1,300 employees on average. And you can see here, if you compare the purple to the green, that the trends are basically indistinguishable.
So how will the coronavirus response ultimately impact citizens' already low faith in government and ultimately how they may cast their ballots? Friend of the show, journalist Zaid Jilani, joins us now via Skype with his perspective. Great to see you, Zaid.
Yeah, great to be here.
How do you think that the sort of failures of the government response here will shift the way that Americans think about what the federal government is actually capable of?
Look, I think something that may be upcoming here is that the Republicans are going to look at this and they're going to say, hey, this is what we've been arguing all along. We tried it your way. We spent trillions of dollars and we barely impacted the unemployment rate, at least with the PPP program. And I think that a lot of average people sitting out there will just think, yeah, the government really can't do anything. Even with such a high price tag, they barely impacted what was happening in the economy. However, the PPP program is not the whole story. For instance, the unemployment insurance and the $1,200 checks did actually lower the official poverty rate, I think in April and May. So some parts of the program actually did work fairly well. And I think those were the programs that were universal, that were administered through programs we already have, like the IRS and using direct deposit or the unemployment benefit systems that every state has. It just really was the PPP program. We chose to go a route where businesses had to apply, where the amount of money was capped. A lot of the money flowed to industries that didn't even see large layoffs, but they were still eligible. That's just that's the peril of having a program where you haven't set up a system that applies it universally, which is kind of what the United Kingdom and Denmark did for their businesses.
Yeah, and let's talk about that, Zaid, which is, you've done a lot of research into this. How much better has results for them worked out, and also spending on a per capita basis?
Yeah, I think from what I understand, most of the European Union countries did not see really any real spike in unemployment rates. They generally have higher unemployment than the United States, but given where their baseline was, I don't think they saw much of a spike in unemployment rates across Europe. And part of that was the fact that what they decided to do was basically subsidize payroll for businesses across the board. So like the United Kingdom, I think they subsidized something like 80% of wages for businesses that were impacted by COVID, and it was applied to almost everybody. I think there were only a few categories that it didn't apply. So it's very different than us. We kind of set up a wait line like outside the DMV, and some people got in, some people didn't, and a lot of businesses that needed it unfortunately did not get in. But that's not the approach they took overseas, and I think it worked out much better for them.
Yeah. I just want to underscore what you're saying here, because I think this is so important. European countries did not see a significant spike in unemployment. The fact that we have massive spike in unemployment here is all because of the policy choices and policy failures of our own government. And Zaid, I think it also bleeds over into the unemployment response, because essentially the government policy was mass unemployment. The easiest thing for most businesses was to lay people off and for people to go on unemployment, which meant that, number one, you have much higher unemployment, but number two, that you have still people who haven't even been able to get on unemployment. We play here miles-long lines waiting to try to talk to a human being at the Kentucky State Capitol of people who've been laid off and still haven't been able to process through those systems because those systems have been so overwhelmed.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And part of that also is the fact that you're dealing with 50 different state unemployment systems because of the way it's administered here in the United States. Probably the single most successful part of the entire CARES Act was the $1,200 checks. Now, those, I don't think that was handled perfectly. There were some people who had kind of a lag response there, but I think it did probably the most to lower the official poverty rate. It did the most to quickly get things to people who had filed with the IRS previously with tax returns. And the government is actually pretty good at just kind of distributing universal cash transfer programs. That includes, for instance, like EBT program. It includes Medicare and Social Security and disability. I mean, it actually knows how to do that and does it fairly effectively. And I think that was probably the model for what should have been done with the rest of the economy. And that's kind of more similar to what I would say United Kingdom, Denmark, EU countries did, which was apply a universal program. It didn't have really any hoops you had to jump through. Certainly wasn't capped. I mean, let's remember the PPP program actually ran out of money very quickly. And then Congress had to fight for some number of weeks just to replenish it. And it wasn't a surprise that so many of the loans flowed to places that honestly didn't end up needing it, like professional and scientific services firms. I think is one thing that Chetty's research found. They ended up receiving a lot of the loans, but they didn't even have layoffs. They were all working from home anyway and probably having great revenue. So,
yeah, I mean, this is something I'd even more like to dig into, Zaid. You've been tweeting a lot about this, and you said it perfectly, which is that they set programs up for failure, or not even necessarily failure. They give all these caveats, and then people who are opponents of government spending will turn around and say, see, we spent money and it didn't even work. Can you talk more about that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like saying, a business rolls out a product, the product fails, and they say, well, we don't need businesses anymore, right? Like there are approaches that work and there are approaches that don't work. I mean, government is just an institution of people, and people do good and bad. Sometimes they screw up, sometimes they do great. And I think there were parts of this CARES Act that did work. And I do think the PPP program at least had the right idea. It was just a huge error to not make it universal, to cap the amount of money. It was very obvious that some businesses would be able to play the process better than other businesses. And when we return to experiences like this, I think we need to look at what worked. And I think to do that in this case, you have to look globally, just because the U.S. response just wasn't that great, at least on the economic side. I mean, I think in public health side, we're maybe the middle of the road here, but I think on the economic side, we probably had one of the worst responses of any country. So,
Well, and the universality that you talk about is really important too, because part of why we care so much that, firms that didn't really need the money got the money is because so many other firms that did deserve the money and needed the money didn't get it. And so universality matters a lot just in terms of the efficacy of the policy. It also matters, though, a lot in terms of political support. And you see this even outside of the coronavirus response. I mean, there's a reason why Medicare and Social Security are really popular, sort of bedrock of American safety net now, and other programs which are means tested tend to get torn apart politically because opponents of them point at them and say, well, that's for other people. Those are for those people, those unworthy people. It's not for the good American citizens. So that universality matters on a number of levels.
Yeah, and I think this is part of the Facebookification of American politics, where everyone has their Facebook profile of themselves. I'm an X, Y, and Z, and as an X, Y, and Z, I need A, B, and C. But that kind of political appeal tends to be very limited. It tends to be much less sustainable. And generally, the things that have gone through a test of American time would be things like Social Security, Medicare, federal Pell Grant programs, and federal loan programs, business support. There's a lot of programs out there that are basically accessible to anybody if you're a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident. And those are the ones that generally have stood through the test of time. And I think going forward, that's something that has to be very closely kind of monitored and accepted, because the alternative is setting up programs that certain groups will game the process. Then people will sour on the idea of having public policy response to begin with. They'll say, well, it just never works. It benefits certain groups of people. It doesn't benefit myself. It doesn't benefit everybody. And there are examples where there's crony capitalism, where there's capture of certain industries. We see this with, for instance, the Exim Bank, Export-Import Bank. So I think that the complaints are not unfounded, but the response doesn't necessarily need to be to give up. I mean, there are successful approaches too.
Yeah, well said. Don't get me started. You're going to trigger me with that XM stuff. Thank you, Zaid. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks.
Next on Rising, the progressive Colorado Senate candidate Andrew Romanoff. He discusses his race and the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee's attempts to stop his bid when Rising returns.